Hello, everybody. Thank you, George. Dave Seglins, who's one of our panelists, asked me who will be here on Friday afternoon, late in the afternoon, to talk about trauma. So thank you for staying. I appreciate it. I should also let you know that from what we're seeing on social and from a lot of emails we've been getting directly to the RTDNA, a lot of people are watching at home, which is great. So it's not just the folks that are here who are getting the benefit of these great discussions. It's also people who are watching at home. It was a bit of a tough decision to make it available online because we did want people to come in, but I think from the reaction we were seeing, it's been well worth it. Couple of housekeeping things before we move on. First of all, please come back tomorrow, and not just to the gala. Apparently we have 150 tickets sold to the gala, which is great. But we also have great panels as well tomorrow, so we'd love to see you all here tomorrow at the very reasonable hour of 10 a.m. If you can make it, that would be great. Secondly, please have a look at the silent auction in the hallway. A lot of great items out there, and lots of room for bidding, so thank you for that. So there's a couple of themes I think that I've sort of seen so far through the conference. One is trust, and the second is mental health. You heard it this morning with the leaders talking about it. You saw our Ukraine reporters being asked about it. It's been a huge issue since the pandemic started, if not before. We did do a session last year on this, and we thought it was important to revisit and do it again and see what, if anything, has changed. I would say one of the things that has changed is that there's been a major study of media workers in this country, and that study has shown some pretty distressing and alarming numbers when it comes to stress, anxiety, and harassment in newsrooms in Canada. So I thought it was very important that we revisit this topic again this year. Dave Seglins, who I mentioned, spearheaded that study, so great to have him here to talk about that. And so without further ado, I will hand off to City News' Faiza Amin to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think this is such a great conversation. And I mentioned to the panel that I started my day out asking my colleagues who occupy various roles, what's your mental health like on the job? And let's just say this conversation is needed. So let's introduce you to the panel here. I'm going to start with Michael Dick here, managing editor of network radio at CBC News and the former executive producer of CBC News in Thunder Bay. Fatima Syed is a journalist with the Narwhal, a lot of jobs here, host of the Backbench podcast and the vice president of the Canadian Association of Journalists. And we'll ask you some questions about your role there. And as John mentioned, Dave Seglins, senior investigative reporter at CBC News, who has also been appointed to the role of well-being champion, something at CBC News, something that you pitched yourself, by the way.
And they went for it.
And they went for it. There you go. Dave, also, you spearheaded a study looking at mental health among media. So us folks in this room here. So that's where I want to start with that Take Care study that was released just a few weeks ago. How did it happen? How did you approach it? And why did you decide to study?
Okay, well, because no one was talking about it. But we have lots of stories, right? We have lots of anecdotes. Okay, I'm asking for a friend here. Does anybody know anybody in journalism that has had a mental health concern? Oh yeah, there we go. Anybody want to fess up to their own, mental health has been an issue on the job? Yeah, okay. So we have all these anecdotes, right? And when I was having my own, PTSD experience a decade ago, I felt pretty alone. Didn't know how to talk to my bosses about it. Was pretty convinced I was the only crazy person in the newsroom, although there was lots of evidence to the contrary. Anyway, look, flash forward, I started getting into this work thinking more critically about how newsrooms and news organizations talk about mental health, and I realized we deal at the level of an anecdote, and I thought it was important that we get some data. And I wasn't convinced that it would be a good idea to ask my boss's permission. Instead, I thought, you know what? I think this would be a good project. Everybody could get behind it, but I think it should be based at a university. So I partnered with Carleton University's Matthew Pearson, who we got together and we thought, how do we measure mental health among our peers? We came up with the idea of an anonymous online survey. I'll tell you a little inside secret. We said if we could get 100 people to answer a survey, and I don't know, how long could we ask of them, like 5 minutes? We thought we'd be pretty successful. So we started going, okay, what questions would we like to ask? And we thought, oh, we've got to ask about COVID. Oh, we got to ask about trauma exposure. Oh, well, we got to ask about, what their health outcomes are like. Oh, we got to ask what life is like in the newsroom when you talk about this stuff. We ended up with a 20-minute online survey. We put it out. We partnered with the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma, with the support of the Canadian Association of Journalists and its French counterpart, the FPJQ. Long and the short of it, for those of you who are familiar, and if you're not, there is a free card that you can scan on your desks. I was spreading the gospel just before the break. We had 1,200 media workers fill out our survey. 900 of them answered every single question, 20 minutes long on average. So it's a credit to this community of journalists, because guess what? We want to talk about this, and there are issues, and now we have some data that helps us begin a conversation, the scale of the problem. There we go, there's a long...
And you began
I go on and on and on, by the way.
And you began this work in 2020, correct?
Yes, fall of 2020.
Such a long time ago. Okay, you mentioned data, and I do want to get into some of the findings from this study here.
Sure, so I'm going to be, my brain is not going to remember on a Friday afternoon all of the stunning statistics that we came up with, but I have 3 slides. We asked people, of the stories that you cover, how many of them are, and we picked a list of, well, we went to some science. There is a tool that psychiatrists will use to help screen for PTSD. It's called the Life Events Checklist. It's got 12 or so. Some of these aren't on the Life Events Checklist, but anyway, we basically asked people this set of questions. How many stories have you covered that deal with these themes, which are known as risk factors for PTSD? And we asked the journalists everything from racist attacks and crime at the top, murders, animal cruelty, suicide. Turns out, and this is just in the past 4 years, keep in mind that the scientific tool that's used to screen for PTSD asks people these questions across their lifetime. So we, in 4 years, have these kinds of rates of exposure. When the general population, there aren't a ton of studies that do, full populations, but generally, people experience 6 to 8 of these across a lifetime. We as journalists are covering this mass diet all the time of these horrible events, so that's a thing. Then we ask the question, all right, so what are the impacts of covering these terrible stories? And so this slide is the coverage-related symptoms over the past 4 years. And the biggest one was burnout. 80% of our 1,200 said, I've had burnout related to trauma stories, anxiety, inability to sleep, depression, all the way down to, a very disturbing one, 1 in 10 of our respondents said, related to a traumatic story, I've had suicidal thoughts. That's pretty alarming. It's something we should think about, talk about, and try to mitigate. And then lastly, we said, okay, so step away from trauma coverage. We just want to know how you're doing. Well, on the various things that we asked about, anxiety, at the very top level, you see the dark blue. This is self-reported. We said, how would you rate your mental health? Well, actually, first we said, how do you like your job? Guess what? Most people have great high levels of job satisfaction. We love our jobs, but our jobs don't always love us, is the line that we're using. Self-reported, 69% of respondents said, I have anxiety. And we said, okay, well, slow down. How many of you have been diagnosed with anxiety? 28% of us have been diagnosed according to the respondents that answered the survey. Now, I will say that I think that there are some biases in the data. I think that anybody who spends 20 minutes filling out a survey like this is probably predisposed to thinking about mental health and journalism. But 28% of our 1,200 colleagues, that's a lot of people, that are saying that they're diagnosed. And importantly, it's far above the average among the general public. Same kind of numbers when it comes to depression. A little closer to the averages when it comes to PTSD, but 15% of us report PTSD undiagnosed, just self-reported. So these are the numbers. This is really depressing. Sorry, depression is a real thing. This is upsetting. This is concerning. But actually, I think having this data and now having this conversation is really good, right? Because we now have a starting point. Now we can start getting real about raising it in the newsroom and finding strategies to contend with it. Anyway, thank you for letting me.
No, of course. And maybe we could stay on this slide for a little bit. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, the discrepancy between self-reported and diagnosed. Do we know why people or journalists and media employees are not maybe seeking help?
Well, I'm not even sure that this says they're not seeking help. It's just like, yeah, I've got depression, but I don't have time to go to the doctor to get them to tell me. I mean, it's kind of like that. I mean, what's the biggest challenge and barrier to dealing with our mental health? Time, right? And so time for self-care, time to go to the doctor, time to commit to going to therapy to talk through the stuff. And by the way, just on therapy, because I'm now evangelizing, there's a really smart guy in Bruce Shapiro, who is the executive director of the Dart Center for Trauma and Journalism based at Columbia University. He encourages people and says, you know what, media professionals and journalists talking through their stuff with a trained professional, there's a really high success rate. This is not a life on the couch. This is, like when you have an upsetting thing, having 3, 4, 5 sessions, there's really good success rate of getting over that, getting back on the horse, and being perfectly good at your job. So I just share that because we need to destigmatize the idea of, oh my God, I'm going to therapy, right? It's actually really successful, talking through the stuff, getting over it, and moving on, getting back to work.
I feel like therapy is in now. It's cool.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Oh, you don't have a therapist? Oh.
Exactly. Okay. This research was presented at the Canadian Association of Journalists Conference, where Fatima, you're a VP there. What was kind of the reception there from media employees as well as our managers and the stations?
It sort of became the theme of our weekend, which was really interesting. And upon reflection, I wonder if that's because it was the first in-person conference a lot of people had been to in the last 3 years. But people were really engaging with it. We had a lot of our keynotes were people who had reported on wars around the world, and it was top of mind for them. And they were talking about how they navigate just seeing what they see in Afghanistan or Ukraine or wherever else they were reporting from. For me, the most interesting thing happened when Dave and Matthew led a workshop where they put to the room, okay, let's just talk about what causes you stress. And Matthew wrote it, and I have a picture on my phone. And the things that came out ranged from the stories we cover to the way we deal with our managers, to just the trust people don't have in media, like the kind of response that people get to their coverage. It was so widespread, and that scared me because I couldn't see one solution that would address everything, like all the causes of negative mental health in our industry. But it was nice to be in a room where you had managers and reporters and union reps and administrators just talking about it and thinking through, okay, let's just talk about freelancers for a second. How do we offer freelancers mental health support even if they're not part of the newsroom benefit system? How do we change our framing? And just workshopping some of those ideas. So I think what Dave and Matthew have done is incredible. As journalists, we always like to say facts matter. We have the facts now, and I hope that we can actually work through them to come up with solutions.
And we'll talk about freelancing in just a little bit, but I want to get this question in for Michael. You mentioned these horrific stories and covering these stories. Before your role here in Toronto, you ran CBC News in Thunder Bay, which is your hometown.
Yeah.
And we know that there have been a lot of just horrific and heartbreaking stories coming out of Thunder Bay that have impacted Indigenous people. So I'm just curious, how was it for you managing the newsroom when these issues are popping up and these stories are here in terms of our conversation here today.
Yeah. I mean, like, I was born and raised in Thunder Bay. That's where I'm proud. I'm very proud to live within Thunder Bay, and over the bridge is Fort William First Nation, which is my community. So I'm Indigenous. So I grew up, in seeing the stories from the other side, and then walking away for a while and starting my own career and trying to redefine myself from what I thought, or the perceptions, the things I'd seen. And then I was in Tokyo. I was working in Tokyo for a couple of years, and the opportunity came back to leave the on-air role and go into the executive producer role. And that didn't scare me. Like moving into a job, that's different. It was, the anxiety was about how do you hold the secrets for a community, and how do you navigate that you have to, in a small town where, there is divide, and I don't think anyone would say there isn't. How do you look at people, who you see at the grocery store, or you see at a baseball game or a hockey game, and how do you reconcile that sort of what and versus what you need to do as a journalist and how you tell those stories. And I think, as a manager or executive producer there, that was always the big thing. The issue was that it's not a fear, but it's how do you talk about a city when you live in the city, and it's an isolated city, and and you have to live there when headlines are great and they produce talk about things, but headlines go away, then you have to live there. And so, like, what does the other 364 days of a story look like? And so that, as a leader and a manager, was the hardest thing. How do you personally hold yourself, to a standard, but hold everyone else to a standard? So it's an extremely hard line, And listen, like, I'm not going to lie. The first three things that in Dave's slides, those all applied to me. The anxiety, depression, like you're worried about things. So yeah, it was a challenge, and it was real. But if you hold yourself to a standard you believe in, you can get through it, and our staff can get through it. But there were a lot of dark days. Like, I'm not going to lie to anybody. There were days where you're like, what the hell am I doing here?
It's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure, and in a small community like that's isolated, the small pressure, small teams have bigger problems, I think, because they're by themselves, and so you have to manage that, and then do the job that you believe in, and then hold people to account, and then have to look them in the eyes after, and that's always the big thing. I always say to people, you have to be able to look them in the eyes after, and feel good about what you did, but you have to live there too.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and you wear many hats at the CBC. Another role that you play is you work with Indigenous journalists to kind of mitigate the impacts that stories have on them.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think we've come a long way, and like when I started 18 years ago, God, I was 12 at the time, by the way. Things were different, and I wasn't always proud to say I was Indigenous because I worried about the fear of that. But you fast forward to like Rome, and I saw a picture of a CTV reporter and a CBC cameraman that I worked with together, and that picture wouldn't have probably been them in Rome covering the Vatican, covering the Apology, wouldn't have existed probably 8 years ago, probably even 5 years ago. But to get to that picture behind the scenes takes a lot of work because. And full disclosure, my father's a residential school survivor. Those moments are hard to get to unless you have a support team there to help you. And it's not like, just saying like we need to get them a counselor, people a counselor. It is an organizational shift about what your values are and how you get to that. And so, we all know we're coming up to the big moment in July where the Pope will be in Canada, and I think we all know what's going to happen. And, that's going to be the next challenge. But I can tell you, people like Dave, when you have to cover a story that's so real to you, how do you tell your family about the story before you tell the public? You know, like, so how do you reconcile that sort of difference? And you know, in our organization, it really does come down to it's a fundamental shift. And there is supports in place, but it's also valuing the experiences of our journalists who are Indigenous and empowering them to help us tell the story.
That was powerful. Thank you so much. I want to talk about freelancers, a conversation that you mentioned in your last response, and you've spent time as a freelancer. So are there specific impacts for media workers who don't have kind of the, I want to say, security of full-time employment?
Yeah, and I think we're hearing it from everyone here. It's isolation, right? The biggest challenge to getting to having a healthy newsroom and a news force in this country is to make sure that no one feels isolated. And unfortunately, we're at a time where the freelance community in news is growing rapidly. I know there's a panel, I think tomorrow, about why people are leaving the industry, or if it was today. But people are working on their own, and they're struggling to have access to the benefits that they need to recover from some of the stories. And freelancers do a lot of hard stories because that's sort of why they're in the industry. They want to do stories about sexual assault cases or you know, racism and so forth. I'm just thinking of all my freelance friends and going through their bylines. So I think the challenge is, okay, you enter a contract with a newsroom, whether it is a broadcast newsroom or an online media or a major newspaper. How does that newsroom create a relationship with the freelancer where, say they need support, like, you know, I'm covering a trial that's going to run for 6 months, it's about a murder, it's going to be traumatic for me. How can the newsroom serve as sort of a casual employer that can still offer benefits to the freelancer, that can still be the person the freelancer feels comfortable going to and saying, hey, I'm not doing okay today, can I get some help? Like, hey, I need to take a break from this trial. I can't go every day. Can I get a fill-in, or is it okay to miss a day? I think often that relationship doesn't exist because freelancers are kind of kept on the outside. They're just kept outside the doors. But I encourage managers in this room and anyone who works with a lot of freelancers to rethink that relationship so there can be a more constructive one.
Yeah, it's a recommendation we came up with. We need to extend benefits to freelancers and casual employees. We just have to. We have a moral responsibility, in my view. And I'm speaking as me, not the CBC. I think if we are going to, and I'll tell you, there's a group in this country, freelance photographers. I think 80% of, you know, professional photographers are freelance. They're struggling. They grab the images that get carried across our newspapers or online services, even in broadcast. They are they're exploring setting up their own peer support network. That's a really good thing. They could use some support from some industry players. I'm just putting that on the table if anyone's got a big pot of money. Yeah, we need to think differently. We owe an obligation to our freelancers. If we're big publishers and we rely on them, we need to support them in the work they do, and that includes their well-being.
There was a union rep at the CAJ conference who I was talking to who said it would be very easy to amend a freelancer's contract to add like $5 or $10 that was just specifically for mental health supports. Like for every assignment or every story or every $100 or something like that. They're exploring this option. So there are solutions available. We kind of just need to grab them.
Another focus of the survey were media workers who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and you found that those reported higher levels of work-related stress. And I'm just curious to find out from all of you here what that conversation should look like, and for you, Dave, what those numbers really say.
You want the white guy to go first? Look, I think...
Hasn't that always been the way?
Okay, well, we're just asking permission. I will cede the floor very quickly. But to say this, I think our study failed a little bit because it skewed heavily white. So I think there's more research that needs to be done to get more responsive to the needs of racialized and more marginalized workers. That includes LGBTQ. It includes proper surveys of people with visible and invisible disability. But people who are feeling marginalized in the work or aren't their true selves at work because they're trying to fit in an environment where, you know, it's predominantly white and they're of color, they are less inclined to be able to put up their hand or feel comfortable raising their mental health issues. Declining an assignment is worse among those who are, and it's also other vulnerabilities beyond feeling excluded through race is age, or if you're a part-time employee, you're new to the job, the last thing you want to do is say, hey, you know, I need to bow out of this one. So anyway.
Yeah, I think, like, you know, the hardest story to tell is about yourself and who you are. And I think we often ask our youngest journalists to tell those stories because they're new to the, you know, we look to different communities to tell, you know, representation. We look to them as young people to tell us, you know, they're the new people and they often have stories that we don't know. But the hardest story to tell is yourself. And you know, once you tell that story, what does it look like after? You know, and I alluded to that a couple minutes ago. And so, you know, we're getting better about, like, supports for people, you know, young, especially young journalists who do some of the frontline work. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. But, you know, I think part of it comes to the recognizing that, you know, we ask a lot from people who are diverse to do some of the heavy lifting and the things that we haven't done and to make up for our shared history in this country. You know, because it's all of our history. And we need to recognize that those are hard stories to do for anybody, even at my age. But at a younger age, we need to support them after, you know, they tell those stories and do that hard journalism for us, because, you know, they're valued for their experience, their experience, and we need to support them in other, you know, beyond the story.
This is always a hard question to answer. So when I started my career, it was at the Star. I was a 16-month intern when they had their one-year intern, and then they canceled and they had it back. That year was crazy. Bruce MacArthur, van attack, Patrick Brown's, you know, sexual assault allegations. There were multiple triple homicides, and the interns covered all of it. We were just fresh out of school, you know, early 20s. We were covering everything, and we had no mental health supports offered in our contract. The first time I got hate, online hate, was after covering a story about a community development project being proposed by, you know, a Muslim group in Thornhill. A really random story to get hate for. I remember being really shaken by it, not sure what to do. The first person to check in on me was Noor Javed, who's the only hijab-wearing journalist at the Star. The second person to check in on me was Shri Pradikar, who's the race and diversity columnist at the Star. My manager did not check in on me. My manager did not ask what's up, everyone knew that it happened. It was available for all to see, but there was no checking up on me afterwards. When we covered the van attack, I was assigned to the only Muslim victim, which was fine. Like, I spoke the language, I understood the assignment, I had to do it. But I worked 6 days that week. And I think, you know, looking back, I wish a manager had said to all of us, okay, tomorrow you're gonna take the day off. The next day you're gonna take the day off. It's gonna be a self-care day for you all. I think Faiza and I became friends because we both received online hate after the Danforth shooting. It was one of the shootings where, which had like a Muslim person implicated, and we got a bunch of Muslim reporters in the city got hate, and we started a group chat afterwards just to check in on each other because there was no one else checking in on us. These things will always happen. I don't think society is going to change overnight to suddenly be kind to journalists or journalists of color specifically. I think the onus, though, is on the newsroom to make sure that we are being mindful of who's suffering what and what they need. It's very simple. I've had editors since who have seen that I'm going through a hard time, that I'm getting a lot of hate after a story. They'll be like, okay, tomorrow is your day off. you're going to unplug Twitter. We're not going to see you until Wednesday. And, we'll tackle it from there.
Yeah.
I want to offer two things. The fact that you went to group chat and supported each other, that's awesome. Because what do we have, right? We've got each other, right? So the more we can normalize conversation amongst ourselves and check in on each other, that's great. That's built-in support. So look to your neighbor, next time you're having a rough day, or that they are, check in. That's awesome. I'm going to say something controversial now where I'm going to defend managers. Sorry, managers. I make it a joke, but it's a thing, right? There's a tension. And I have no managers in my life that get up in the morning and try to be bad people. They're all good people. They get promoted and they excel in their careers because they're really good journalists, and they know how to make the wheels turn to go get stories. Very few signed up to be people managers. Very few signed up to be mental health experts. So as this conversation changes, and as we are experiencing the most acute mental health crisis we've seen in our lifetimes, given the pandemic, given the war, given the political polarization, the online hate and harassment, the reckonings with racism, the reckoning with Indigenous genocide in this country, all of these things that are really unique to the last few years, the demands are huge on the managers, and they too need tools, and they need education and learning and literacy, and they don't all have it. I'm doing training with leaders where they confess this. I need tools. I need help figuring out how to help my people. It's not that they don't want to, but so I say all of this because I think that the conversations around mental health, we had a big session at the CBC yesterday, and there are a lot of people calling on managers, please help with this, please help with that. And I think it's true, managers do have to step up, they have responsibilities, but I urge all of us as this conversation evolves, is to know that we're all coming to this, with limited comfort or limited skills, and I think to make the change in the culture of our news industry, we have to be good to each other and know that we're all kind of on a path.
Did you answer that question, Michael? Did you? It felt like so long ago I asked that question.
That's me, sorry.
I'll pass.
But that does lead us to another question about what more companies and managers can do, and all of you play a different role in your newsroom. So I'm just interested to see what you guys think.
Well, I think the fact that we're sitting in a boardroom at the Hilton is a good start. No, I mean that seriously, because the conversations didn't exist even when I started 18 years ago. Like, you saw something bad, when you were a reporter, you just sucked it up and went home. And you just did that. You repeat cycle, and and that coping mechanism leads to sometimes bad decisions and not good decisions. I think the fact that, like I said, we're in this room now, is that this conversation is a real conversation that didn't exist a while back. And to Dave's point, like I'm a manager. I'm not an expert in everything. I don't know how to handle some things. So I think the ongoing education for all of us is so key, because we're all learning. And to Dave's point, like 3 years ago, some of the conversations we were having, a pandemic, like who thought that was going to happen? The reckoning with some of how we treat Indigenous people in our country, and racial conversations, they weren't there, and those are things now that are top of mind and in the forefront. But the people in the room that you now lead are the people who are part of that conversation. And so, I don't think anyone tomorrow is going to be like, we solved it all, awesome, let's go home. The world looks like a little better place.
I wish.
But it's the ongoing conversation and the ongoing education, and I think that's the fundamental thing, is that we all have to learn from each other and learn more.
Fatima?
Can I be the contrarian on the panel? With the utmost respect for managers, of course, it's a very unique job and a taxing one, but this isn't a problem that appeared overnight. it was years in the making. If we talk to, BIPOC journalists who've been in the industry for a decade, they will tell you that they were struggling with their mental health, way before we started talking about it in the industry. And I think the only reason we are talking about it is because there is a new generation of journalists that is unapologetic about making it known that they're not doing okay, and they need to take a break to do their best work, because ultimately that's what this conversation is about, right? If our mental health suffers, we can't be the best journalists that we want to be and that we know we're capable of being, and do the best work that our society needs. So I actually do believe that there is an onus for us, as great as this conversation is, we should have started it ages ago first. And second, the solutions are out there. The Toronto Star implemented like a huge mental health benefit in every reporter's contract after there was a suicide in the newsroom. It shouldn't have taken, the worst possible thing to happen in that newsroom for that benefit to be offered. And I worry if we just keep waiting for things to get really, really bad and then enact solutions, it'll be too late for a lot of people in the industry, and we'll lose amazing, amazing journalists who we really, really need right now. And I know it sounds like I'm trash talking the Star. I'm not. I love them. I just know the story really well. I think managers can do it. I work for a news organization that's only been around for 4 years, and when they started designing the contract, it was like mental health front and center. Like, how do we make sure this is embedded in the very workflow of the newsroom, in the very ethos of the way that we function? I think it can be done. I think managers just need to do it.
So, if I may, show of hands, how many of you have access to or work in a newsroom that has a course on mental health in news? 1, 2. So not so many. So we need training that is specific to journalism, not some off-the-shelf course about here's mental health and here's self-care and all that. No, we need to think about mental health when you're working overnights, when you're working with graphic imagery, when you are under the pressures of multiple deadlines, filing for multiple platforms, all of these sorts of things. I'm really grateful that that is something that we've achieved at CBC. We've built it. Now we just have to get people to get through the course, because I ultimately believe literacy around all of this, normalizing conversation, this is the way we're going to uplift. And we're not there yet, but that's one small thing. It's not about benefits. Well, it is about benefits, but it's not as simple as saying, well, if we just up benefits. And it's not just as simple as saying, oh, if you've had a bad day or you're struggling, go to counseling outside of here. You're absolutely right. We have to bake it into the way we do it, way that we do our jobs. We do this exercise in the course that we do, and we've also done it larger. Before people went to Rome at CBC, we had a group of our journalists come in, and we did planning for difficult stories. And it's just like any other kind of risk assessment, and it doesn't have to be a drawn-out process. But you can plan for difficult stories beforehand. Okay, what's this going to be like? Who might be affected? Are these people up to it? Like, thinking about it. How are we going to check in? So you got a bit of a plan. Then the story's going on. You're executing the plan. You're checking in. Here's another question. How many of you journalists on a regular basis make time for lunch? 1. Perfect. So that's my point, right? We don't build it into the way we do things. And whose job is that? It's not just us journalists. It's also the assignment desk checking in. Have you had lunch? Or if you're on a multi-day shoot, have you had rest? You only got 3 hours sleep? Oh, well, maybe the assignment desk should help you figure out how you're going to manage that day, because now you've got a low battery, and if you're going into some really heavy stuff, that puts you at high risk. And then there's afterwards and checking in on people. There's detail to all of this that I won't stretch out, but going from learning to then changing practices on how we cover stories, not just we individual journalists, but also how the assignment desk has conversations and has plans in place, that's fundamental to changing it.
Michael?
Dave's did a lot of it, but I'll play off Dave here. So how many people here have a manager who's diverse? So there's, 2 hands, I think, sorry? So to your point, just like 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been, like, managers didn't look like me, you know? And so to your point, we're still figuring out too how we reconcile, you know, being leaders who are diverse leaders. And that's an education process for all of us. And the fact that two people here have someone who is a diverse leader speaks to that. Like, it is, and I'm not speaking about for managers here, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, like, it's not just as easy as saying sometimes to just do this and that. It's like, how do you how do you converse with a room of people who have thought one way all the time? And how do you bring those values in? So, you know, it's an ongoing process. And to your point, like, you know, I think like we're, you know, the Rome coverage is coming up soon. Like, you know, the Pope coming. I think that's one of the most important deployments that any journalist will go on. And I'll take my Indigenous hat off for a second and just speak as a human being, because that is about telling a story that is so important to the fabric of our country and to religion, which is so important to so many people. And so, for me, what keeps me up at night is thinking about that, about how do we support our journalists, Indigenous or not, who will be covering this story that is so personal to the fabric of our nation, and then what the story looks like after. You know, it is sometimes the words "I'm sorry" are easier to say than "I love you." And so, how do you start having that conversation about "I love you"? And so, I think that is where we have to start thinking about is like we get so hot and covered in the moment of things, but we sometimes get lost in the conversations that happen after when people are left alone, and then a nation is left alone. So I think like that is so important, you know, and people like David, and you know, I can speak for my organization, you know, are at the forefront of that, like having those conversations about, you know, the difficult conversations that will come and how hard it will be for people. Sorry, I went on a little tangent there, but I just wanted to, you know, just hat back on.
John, how are we for time? Continue or question? Okay, let's go to question. Reporters aren't that good with numbers, so I thought I would just get it vetted first.
Just while we're getting someone, I will just grab the opportunity again. Fiona Conway, RTDNA, just pulled me aside before this event and said, you know, like it was 2014 and I came back from a conference and we were talking about trauma and how we needed to get more informed, and we tried to push it forward, and that was 2014. I just say that for the record.
Hi.
It's Nicole Martin from CHCH News. I was really appreciating hearing about the CBC's policies when it comes to working through difficult stories, how you're going to cover them, but I am curious about the aftermath. How does the CBC go about having conversations with reporters, and what's the protocol?
So that is a great question that I've been asking in my courses. What's the protocol? And everybody has a different answer because we're not really clear on what the protocol is. But we're getting there because we're talking about it. So that's one thing I would say. I think it's different from all over the place. I know that we are now intentionally, and our supervisors, and we say managers, but there's all sorts of people like senior producers, executive producers who send people out the door and have roles sort of supervising our working lives. We are trying to move to a model where check-ins are regular. It's not just because we think, oh my God, that was terrible and you're going to be affected and right, that we're all nervous and worried. We're just trying to build in regular checkups, like how was it? That was a crappy story. Like anyone's going to feel lousy because these stories make us feel lousy. That's number one. And number two, we are attempting something new when it comes to the counseling services. At CBC, we are very fortunate. We have a very generous benefits coverage where we have psychology services covered unlimited at 90%. So I always recommend to our people that if you are deeply affected, go to the doctor, get a referral to a psychologist if you can get one. And over the pandemic, we've also had social workers covered. Our EAP, you know, we've often said, oh, go to the EAP because there are counselors on standby. They're not trauma counselors, and they don't understand the journalism industry. So CBC is now exploring with a company, so our teams coming back from Ukraine and our teams that have covered the Texas and Buffalo shootings are now getting specialized counseling from a company in the UK that has an international network of specialist clinicians who actually specialize in journalists. So that's new, and it's a small victory, but I think it is a possibility for kind of specialized response to the kinds of things we go through.
And I'll just say on that, with the deployment to Rome and the deployment that will come, we've had elders working with our staff, very one-on-one on the issues.
Wow. I do want to ask you, and maybe Michael, you might be best to answer this question, because I know we have people across Canada who are tuning in who couldn't be here in Toronto. I know there are some managers and colleagues here who know someone who's in a smaller market. I started out in northern British Columbia, and oftentimes it's quite isolating. So how do we get this on the radar there? How can an employee who is in an isolated newsroom maybe approach this conversation with their manager and maybe try to get a little bit of what Dave did here in Toronto?
Yeah, listen, it's hard, and a lot of people who start out in smaller markets, and they're trying to prove something, and they want to get their name noticed, and no one wants to look weak sometimes, which I think is a scary thing. Having been the exec in Thunder Bay, that was always my number one concern. A small team of 11 people, half have lived in the community for 100 years. The other half are new people there, and it's an interesting conversation because there's no right or wrong answer. But for me, it was about mentorship. It was about giving people the mentorship they needed from people who could help them. We had just as a quick example in Thunder Bay, and not to use another Indigenous example, but I will. We had an intern started out who's now employed with the CBC full-time in a different market. But I asked a senior Indigenous producer to mentor her because it's a small town and it's different. Yeah. And so he would drive her to and from work every day for months and take her home. And in that space, they built trust, which I think is so key to all of this, is trust in the people around you. And in those conversations, he got to learn more about her and what her concerns were. And he got to learn more about the concerns and what new journalists are experiencing. And that's a long way of saying that it's all about the conversation and helping people get the conversation. And as a leader, I would say, showing humility, that you also, you are scared too. That it's okay to it's okay to not feel good all the time about what you're doing, and that you're just like everybody else. Because like last time I checked, I don't wear a Superman cape to work. I could barely fit into this shirt because of COVID. It's okay to say, that you're also hurting too. Mm-hmm. And then just in Thunder Bay when I worked there, those stories about the police, I'm sure all of you know, those are like, those are things those are people you've talked to, and it's okay to say you're hurt and things hurt you. Yeah. But it's also important to remind people that the conversation isn't a 9-to-5 conversation. I think that's where, and I always say this to my peers and to young people, we get fixated on the 9-to-5. That's our job, is to manage people from the moment we deploy them out the door until the assignment gets in. I always worry personally about the 5 to the 6 a.m. Where are those lost hours, and what are you doing to help them in those hours? Because people need support. Mm-hmm. And I think just acknowledging that is very real.
Our manager, where's Amar? I just want to give a shout out to Omar, because I know that mentorship piece and the fact that he manages a lot of employees with City News across Canada, I know that he's quite vocal and has expressed connecting employees who are in more isolated parts of the country with others. So that's something that I would have loved, I think, back when I wasn't here. So that's, I think, an important piece for all of us to be able to reach out.
Hi. So my question is actually for Fatima, because I think there's two approaches, different approaches that are kind of emerging in terms of how newsrooms are going about this, and also the expectations from employees of their managers. And I wanted to know what actionable ideas you had for managers and how they can support and offer mental health support to their reports?
That's a really good question. It doesn't make me uncomfortable at all because I'm not a manager. Honestly, the most success I've had in dealing with managers are when they check in. You know, I'm a climate journalist. I can possibly be depressed all the time based on what I cover, because the world is really messed up, you guys. But you know, we have these like weekly check-ins as a newsroom at the Narwhal, and our managers will come up with a fun question to start the meeting, something that we can be thinking about throughout the week. So, you know, what gave you hope this week? It could be something really small, something really trivial, something really powerful, or tell us about the best meal you had this week. Or, you know, your best travel story, your worst travel story, something light and uplifting to remind you that there is a reality beyond the work that you do that you can also indulge in and be okay in. You know, when Amber Bracken, who's a photojournalist in the West, when she got arrested recently doing work for the Narwhal, that was a really heavy day for our newsroom. And I remember our manager calling us all one by one, being like, "Are you okay? What do you need? Do you want to take some time off? Like, this is hard." Everyone was very emotional. I honestly think, you know, beyond the resources and benefits and the protocol and the structures that we're all working through, having someone just there who you feel comfortable telling when you're not okay goes a long way. And I didn't have that for a very, very long time, and I've worked in various different newsrooms, so it's a very brand new feeling, you know, when my manager calls me saying like, "Are you okay? Is there anything you need?" And I was honestly blown away the first time someone asked me. I was like, do I say that I'm fine even though I'm not? Because it actually crossed my mind, because I'm like, I just started this job. I don't want to tell them that I'm not okay because of the story that I just put out, but I'm actually not okay. So yeah.
And if I can just add to that, you know, even beyond the mental health discussion, one of the questions we asked here, and I've been thinking a lot about this in our training, because we don't have it yet in our training, but I think we need it, is just the issue of regular feedback, right? Who here feels like they get adequate regular feedback from their boss? A few, that's good, that's good. Feels good, right? It validates you, you know, you're paying attention to my work, good. Too many of us report that we don't get feedback. And so the times we are talking, it's like about mental health, and it's like, oh, I'm talking to the boss. And it's not a normal conversation. So to your question, what can managers do? We can build in just a regular culture of feedback, you know.
Or just conversation.
Or just conversation, that's right.
An open door policy, or if you're not okay, you feel free to message me, or just so that anyone in the newsroom is comfortable approaching them.
I mean, I have a theory, like, we worked a deadline and we're working with so few resources that we have so little time to be human, right? It kind of comes down to that. And if we could just take a little bit more breath, and like other work environments treat their people differently. Like, hey, how are you? How was your weekend? Like, it's small little things, but anyway.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Yeah, sure. John, I'm 15 seconds over. I'm okay? Okay, I'll wait. That's consistent.
Hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. So, yeah, this is great that you guys are having this conversation. We're having this conversation. And I'm curious about the study that was done. It was a snapshot in time. And sadly, we're all aware of kind of the long-term effects that sometimes befall some journalists with PTSD and so on and so forth. I'm just wondering if you guys have any insights or data strategies. You've kind of been discussing some, but for the long-term sustainability. Like, these are all intermittent strategies and good ideas. I'm just wondering if there's been any thought put towards long-term sustainability for people who have careers in journalism.
Nope. I think we're kind of in survival mode almost. No, actually, not to go back to this, it sounds a little bit abstract, but this whole idea of literacy, like, look, we've moved the dial. Like, we're having this conversation in a different way, so that's success. Carving out space to do that in the conversations you have in your newsrooms with colleagues. That is success. If you can get some training, if we can elevate the literacy, I think over time we're going to continue to move the needle. And the goal is ultimately to make it sustainable. I mean, who loves their job? Right? We like what we do. So that the goal is to make it better so that we can continue doing our jobs and play the roles that we play. So that's, to me, that's the answer to longevity is ultimately, I mean, this is another big idea that is not a silver bullet, but it's about a culture shift, right? We have to shift the culture, and that seems so big, but it starts by talking, and it starts by bringing learning into the news environment around mental health.
Any final words anybody wants to
I was just going to
add
say to that point, though, like, we're talking about something that used to be a submarine, honestly, like, it was under the water, no one talked about it. That's now a ship, and then we're now trying to turn the ship around. And so I think it's to your point, it's gonna take difficult conversations and meaningful action by people at all different levels to, one, keep the conversation going, and two, to commit to the actions that come out of each of those conversations that are tangible and fruitful to your staff. So, like, it's not going to be solved in a day or a month or a couple of years.
Fatima, final words.
Oh God, the pressure. The CAJ has this mentorship program that we started in 2019, just before the pandemic started. And one of the things that people say most in their applications is, I just need someone to talk to. I just need someone to talk to about my struggles and the fact that I'm not okay, I don't know what I'm doing, I just need help. If there's any takeaway from David Matthews' amazing report and this conversation, the CAJ conversation, and the many other conversations Dave and Matthew are going to have with the industry, I want that feeling to go away. I want to make sure everyone has someone to talk to. If it's someone in management, that would be epic. That would be amazing. And I know that's a lot of onus on managers, but that's kind of the job, you guys. But even just the industry, whether it is a group chat where you become, lifelong friends who check in whenever, or it's, the occasional newsroom meeting where you just talk about something fun, something light to take away from the dark periods. I'd love one day to have an application that says, I'm okay, I just need help finishing this big investigation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and big thank you to our panelists here.
Thank you for spending Friday afternoon.
I know. We all did it, folks. We made it.
Thanks for me also, Dave, Michael, Fatima, and Faiza. Really important discussion. I know one that we will continue. Before you go, we have one other giveaway that we're going to do. Before we do that, just wanted to do a special shout out and thanks to CNN News Source. Major supporters of the RTDNA conference, both financially and in terms of the swag that you all love. So thank you to CNN News Source. Thank you, Joe Conboy, who's here. Joe makes the effort every year to come up here and to be with us. And for those of you who know Joe as a supplier to your newsroom, also a huge support in terms of the great options that CNN has for broadcasters. So thank you. Also thanks to our production partners, Platform Productions, and Scott and Andrew. Thank you all. It's always flawless, which is great. A reminder, we're back tomorrow. It's not too early. 9:30 coffee, 10 o'clock we start the discussions again. Some great panels tomorrow, including a look at convoy coverage with some of the reporters who were there. And the other thing that has been, we'll be talking a lot about in this conference, which is the Great Resignation, people leaving, the problems of recruiting people into the business, and the resultant loss in trust in some of the things that we do. So really interesting day tomorrow. But to cap it all off, one final giveaway from George. Thank you.